Hello and welcome to Season 2, Episode 2 of It's All Relative, the podcast that takes a light-hearted look at the generation gap, exploring it in a way that makes sense to us all, our families. I'm your host, writer and historian, Dr. Eliza Filby, and each episode I interview two guests from the same famous family to discuss their contrasting lives, experiences and values. If you are at all familiar with Alastair Campbell, chances are you have a strong opinion about him. As the former Director of Communications, Tony Blair, Campbell's media management and message discipline was instrumental in making the Labour Party electable again. Indeed, it was Campbell who coined the term New Labour. Once his time in the political spotlight was over, Campbell could so easily have faded into obscurity, retreating into corporate PR or the after-dinner speaking circuit like his predecessors. And yet he chose not to, finding fresh prominence defending Blairism in the age of Corbyn, campaigning for a second Brexit referendum, and most recently in the chart-topping The Rest is Politics podcast with fellow outlier, former Conservative MP Rory Stewart. In Campbell's own words, he is a workaholic, one who enjoys a platform and fears irrelevance. But this is also symptomatic of his deep desire for control, which is inextricably linked to his depression. As he wrote candidly in his book on mental health, "I want to fix it all, but despite being the guy who is supposed to be able to fix things, I can't. This feels like a personal failure. This can quickly lead to feelings of helplessness, and my depressive spiral kicks in once more." Campbell has become one of the most thought-provoking campaigners on mental health, detailing his own struggles with addiction and depression, and doing so with a brutal honesty, an intellectual curiosity, and a political edge. Not to mention a level of self-reflection that you rarely see in public figures these days.
I could listen to this all day.
It's nearly over. I'm going to get onto your daughter in a minute. Hang on. Campbell is a baby boomer by birth, a personification of the social mobility of the late 20th century. A grammar school boy done good, who made it to Cambridge and was fast-tracked through the ranks of Fleet Street right to the centre of power. And yet, at 63, with his Instagram lives, his incessant tweets and blogs, he's also someone who feels compelled to remain current, to embrace the changing world. In fact, all these years after delivering the political earthquake of 1997, he's still trying to shape the future. Campbell is currently writing a book on young people and politics. Alastair is joined by his daughter, comedian and feminist campaigner Grace Campbell. Grace was just 3 when Labour won victory in 1997. With both mum and dad working in Number 10, Grace became a regular visitor, hanging out on school inset days with David Blunkett's dog and attending diplomatic receptions with foreign dignitaries, which in her words felt like a freshers' fair with lots of awkward people not knowing who to speak to. But there was also a less fun side, particularly during the Iraq War, with protesters outside her home and her parents politically divided over the conflict. Growing up in the political cauldron was the inspiration for her one-woman show at Edinburgh Fringe, Why I'm Never Going Into Politics. But it was her debut book, Amazing Disgrace, where her millennial feminist zeal was truly unleashed. Part memoir, part manifesto, Grace unpicks the distorted narratives and disrupting experiences of young womanhood, displaying a level of self-awareness which, I have to admit, I wish I'd had in my 20s. When I was younger, she said, I wanted to be like my dad, someone who was loud, who could lead conversations and make people laugh. Grace is doing just this as the host of the disgraceful comedy club that has a residency at Bush Hall and as a co-founder of the campaigning group The Pink Protest, redefining feminism for the 21st century generation. I'm more liberal than my father, more feminist than my mother, she once said. And as a self-proclaimed oversharer, she is finding her path with all the scrutiny and self-expression that comes with a life on social media. Grace is currently writing her next one-woman show, a show about men, for the Edinburgh Fringe. Grace, Alastair, welcome to It's All Relative.
Absolutely loved that.
Fabulous. But why
I
was
have
she...
never heard anything so wonderfully... Honestly, research. I don't remember saying any of those things, but I definitely did.
Well, I feel like I've lived with both of you for the past week, actually, because I've been delving deeply into your writings, your podcast that you did jointly together, and all the things that you've done throughout your relatively short life and your relatively long life. What I'm intrigued by is your relationship. So I wondered, let's start with you, Grace. How would you describe your relationship with your dad?
I think it's good. I think we have a good relationship now. I think as you will understand from reading about both of us, and obviously you already have an idea of him, he's very alpha, and then I've tried to be very alpha to sort of emulate his energy. So that has clashed at points, but we have a good relationship.
Yeah, definitely.
I think.
So quite often the child is, has a rebellious place, or a need to rebel against the parents. Is there anything that you feel sort of cringe when you listen to her comedy, or you get embarrassed by?
I mean, some of the sex stuff I could probably live without.
But that's why he's amazing. Because he would never be like, I'm not coming, or I can't sit through that. Him and my mum, they're just so game. People ask me that all the time. How do your parents feel?
I think mum finds it even harder than I do.
Yeah.
What I do when I'm watching Grace perform, actually the Edinburgh show you mentioned, because that was a lot about us, that I just found that really funny to be in the audience. She's taking the piss out of me. The audience are looking around to see if I'm laughing, and I found it very funny. I did find a lot of it very, very funny. And she has got great sort of observational skills, so she's always been able to make me laugh ever since she was little, and that's quite a big deal, I think, in any relationship. But then what I do, like there was one she did at Bush Hall recently. I went, and the audience was 90% young women. I was definitely the oldest person in the room. I was one of a very small number of men. I was sitting next to Fiona, and she comes on, and the first thing she says is, go on, to the audience, go on, admit it. You're looking and thinking, I bet she does anal.
That's actually quite funny.
Well,
no, that's also not the joke. He's just completely butchered the joke.
No, I haven't butchered the joke.
That is not the joke, but I'm not going to do the joke. But
the point is that's, oh my God.
My friend sat in front of them and said it was like the best thing in the world, because he would hear my dad go, what did she just say? And my mum would be like, that she got chlamydia.
So that's quite, but I put myself into a kind of outer body situation. I pretend that I'm just watching a comedian.
Mm-hmm. And likewise then, Grace, do you kind of see your dad's tweets and be like, oh, Dad, or go on his Instagram lives and be a bit like, oh, please, just turn them.
Instagram live?
When I was in America last year, and I woke up one day to like 20 DMs from strangers on Instagram saying, hey, I'm really sorry, I'm not sure if you're going to see this, but your dad has done an Instagram live and he's forgot to turn it off. And he's just walking across the heath and has bumped into Neil Kinnock. And it's on Instagram.
It was Rachel.
It was Rachel, yeah. Neil's daughter. Anyway, I woke up like 8 hours too late because I was in America. And luckily you realised before you bitched about anyone.
It was
apparently all you did was talk about ABBA.
We talk about ABBA. We both go to the ABBA Avatar concert. We're both obsessed about ABBA. So we had this long chat about ABBA. And then when I got home and I realised I'd be broadcasting a combination of, and when Fiona and I walk around the heath with the dog, I would reckon it's guaranteed 15 conversations with different people. And you know that thing where you talk to somebody, then as you walk on, you say, God, I can't stand that guy. there was a bit of that, but nobody kind of knew who it was. But yeah.
I know. So, I mean, his social media is comedy to me.
And what do you disagree about?
I get a bit agitated by Grace's loudness. And I mean both her physical loudness, that she speaks very, very loudly.
I've kind of lost my voice at the moment, so I'm sounding very calm.
Fiona and I are very, very quiet in the way we speak. And also the loudness of her personality, which I like most of the time, but sometimes it can be very, very wearing. It's like if something is going wrong in Grace's life, it isn't just that she's lost her phone. It's just that she's lost her phone, and that is the biggest loss of any phone that there has ever been anywhere in the world. And why aren't we as upset and angry? And why? And the other thing I find quite difficult is that, Fiona, look, we both probably spoil our kids a bit out of the guilt of not being there enough when they were growing up, sort of stuff. But Fiona with Grace is just like, if Grace sort of walked in and said, oh, I really like that painting, you want to buy it for you, darling?
Well, that's just the privilege of being youngest at
three. No, it's the privilege of being manipulative.
So what about politics? Do you disagree? I mean, Grace, I read that you had a sort of flirtation with Corbyn.
Yeah, but that was when Corbyn had somewhat of an appeal. That did then die. Did that
cause any ructions between you two, or were you just...
Yeah, it did, but they were just both very patronising, and they were like, we're old, you're young, we're smart, you're dumb. Very Danny DeVito.
It wasn't that. It was my view, I remember we were on holiday in France, and Grace was saying, I think I'll vote for Corbyn. And I was like, well, if Corbyn becomes leader of the Labour Party, I think it's possible we'll never win again. That was my genuinely held view. And it was nothing, and I've always tried not to be personal about that. But this is the other thing about Grace, who, by the way, you've asked me about her things that annoy me. I love Grace to bits, right? But she.
By the way, I didn't get to say what I don't like about him.
Oh, sorry.
We'll
come back to that.
We'll come back to that. We'll come back to that.
I've parked it.
We'll come back to that. Is that she does sort of sometimes talk about things like politics as though she knows more than we do, and she's got more experience than we have, and we don't really understand politics in the way that she does because she's young, right? Well, I think I understand politics quite well because I'm older and I've been involved in it for a very long time. But Grace will quite often say, you don't really know what you're talking about.
I haven't said that for years. Now I've matured and I can see that you know more than I do on certain things, same way I know more than you do on certain things.
Yeah.
So
what annoys you about me?
I think you're a perfect human. Honestly. You've just got absolutely no patience. You've got no patience. You snap too easily.
Going back to the generational divide then, what do you think, apart from perhaps the politics issue, what makes it feel most apparent, the generational divide?
This is kind of what I'm saying, because you would think, right, with like, I go on stage and I talk about the kinds of things that like even comedians I know who are my age, women, would never, ever, ever do if their parents were in the room, right? I've never, ever, ever felt that there's anything I can't say in front of them, or there's not a boundary that I can't push in my work. They've never read anything I've written and been like, oh, you can't say that, even if it's like slagging them off. Like it's something that feel so lucky to have, and it's why I've felt like I've got freedom to say what the fuck I want, like on stage.
Don't swear.
But so I don't know if you're going to find much, because that would be the one thing that you might think that we'd have some like push and pull on, but we don't. So look, we've got a generational divide on. He thinks I'm spoiled. He claims that he like grew up living in a gutter and like really struggled in life. I don't believe it. Like, I met his parents. They seem really middle class, but he sort of has this narrative that like I've had it really easy like super spoiled and like nepotism and everything, which is true.
Well, also, if you are spoiled, whose fault is that? Parent?
A little bit, yeah. No, but I don't know. Actually, I don't think we do spoil them. But it's things like, no, it's less spoiled. I think Grace is unbelievably entitled in relation to us. So like, if we have a plan to do something, but it doesn't fit with what Grace actually suddenly decides is a better thing to do, it's like we have caused World War III.
That's not true. That is such bollocks, honestly.
What I'm interested in is, how has Grace influenced your views on certain things? So maybe feminism.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. We used to clash. He I don't know if you know, but he once did this LBC thing, phone in, and then I called in. And I remember when that happened, we were actually clashing quite a lot on things. And like, he would be so, oh, don't talk about your periods, or don't talk about that. Whereas now I've pushed him to the point that he just sort of is numb to it.
Have you become a better feminist?
I think so, yeah.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, I think so. I think I've become, it's funny enough, I was at a football match the other day. Because I'm a Burnley fan, I went to watch Arsenal beat Leeds because I want Leeds to go down rather than us. And I was with these guys. It was it was quite a blokey kind of session. And there was quite a lot of, women's football was on the telly, Arsenal or West Ham. And there was a lot of kind of, who wants to watch women play football? And I was saying, listen, I think it's great women play football. I think there's a possibility that I'd have been more in the other camp, because I now see it I've got to see a bigger picture. Mm-hmm. And I do think Grace definitely changed my views.
He's been so good at like there have been a few things that like if he gets asked to do something and it's like there's like one woman on the panel now, like he'll observe that and comment on it and say, I'm not doing this unless it's like more diverse. Like those are ways that you've actually, and also he's really good at calling stuff out now, like sexism. When you see it online, I don't even have to prompt you, and I'll go online and you've done a cracking tweet about it.
A cracking tweet.
So that kind of cross-fertilisation learning is intergenerational. So what Grace, could you just, I know you delve into this a lot in your stand-up show, but what was it like? Can you just take us back what it was like to be a young kid, running around the corridors of Number 10 and how that was and how that impacted you?
Well, I guess he's already said I'm pretty entitled, so perhaps that might be one of the root causes of it. I obviously didn't know any different, like genuinely. He started working for Tony Blair when I was 3 weeks old, so it was all I knew really. Actually, what I found more difficult to get used to is when we were no longer powerful. That was awful.
Where's the chauffeur gone?
And I was no longer like meeting the Spice Girls and being able to go to whatever concert I wanted to go to.
You still, when have you never gone to a concert that you wanted to go to?
I've wanted Glastonbury tickets 5 years in a row.
That's something we disagree on. I don't get the Glastonbury thing at all.
No,
I'm
but
not
that
going to
was
bust
more
the
what
gut.
I wasn't used to, was when it suddenly stopped and he was at home all the time, and that was nice in a way. But then I was like, God, we're like not important or relevant anymore. I'm going to have to do it myself.
Was there, I'm imagining this kind of coterie of kind of Blair babies, kind of Jack Straw's kids and, Blair's kids. Was there kind of these Blair babes just running around Number 10?
No. I think you didn't go in that much, did you? You went in a fair bit.
When they were inset days. Well, because my mum worked there.
Yeah,
as
of
well.
course. Yeah.
No, I think that the obviously the Blair children, but they were probably the only children that and Philip Gould's kids. But that was more outside Number 10. That was like outside. But no, and it was, the fact that Fiona was working with Cherie, so you actually did do loads of stuff together, like I think including the Spice Girls.
And we went to the EastEnders set.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
I remember once taking the Blair boys to an Oasis concert because neither of their parents could. So there's sort of stuff like that. And actually, we've all done pretty well. Tony's kids are really nice people. I hope my kids are, and I think they are, and I think most people who know them think they are. And they're all sort of doing very different things. What I like about all three of our kids is that they're all doing stuff that I probably wouldn't do. But I like the fact that they're doing it. I like, we've got one son who's built up his own business that is basically in sports data and gambling and analytics and stuff. We've got another son who's sort of, he did work in the Labour Party for a while, but then he's gone into kind of strategy and he's involved in making films. And Grace doing her comedy and stuff. I suppose Grace, I think eventually Grace will write a lot. I think she'll become a more prolific writer than at the moment. But and I love the fact that she's giving it a go at something that's incredibly difficult. I mean, the truth is most comedians don't make it.
Exactly.
And I think that I know from my own experience of just like sometimes I'll do I did a speech in Dublin the other day. I just stood up and spoke for an hour, and then this woman came up with this. I don't know how you do that. You can just stand up and you just talk for an hour like that about this and this, and that's because you get used to it and you can develop. But along the way, there are loads of people who can't. They try and do that stuff and they bomb. And likewise with Grace, I've seen her and I've, I know I'm biased, but I think she's very, very funny.
I am very good. I've really worked very hard. It hasn't just happened overnight.
And also I've studied the audience. I like watching the audience.
So I want to talk a bit about now social media. So who's more addicted to their phone, would
Definitely
you say?
him.
No.
I have a healthy relationship with my phone.
How so?
Let's see who's got higher screen time.
Can you look?
Yeah.
Oh, but listen, I do my work. I write on the phone.
So do both of us. Thank you very much.
Alastair, you're someone who...
What's the thing again?
I wonder if there a contradiction that you see between the kind of the agreeing.
Yeah, I do see a contradiction.
Okay, you know what I'm going to ask then, don't you?
Yeah.
The conflict between your Twitter persona, which is quite aggressive, and then the podcast, which is about agreeing.
Yeah, but I think
disagreeing
doing the
agreeably.
podcast with Rory Stewart, who does call me up a bit on my kind of aggression against the Tories. And look, I'll lay it on the line. I think this is the worst government this country's ever had, and there's not one good person in that cabinet. That's my view. Now, I'm not going to resile from that because it's what I believe. I see what they do to the country, and it makes me very, very angry. So
yours is way higher, by the way.
I just work harder. I get up early.
No, that's bullshit. Because
Work harder is not a defence.
He's on Twitter an average 2 hours and 11 minutes a
bullshit.
day.
Absolute
my
bullshit.
goodness.
Not bullshit.
All that means is that my phone is on.
What's that?
I'm not on Twitter.
GarageBand. What are you doing on GarageBand?
Okay, let's bring
What
this
is
back. Let's bring
GarageBand?
us back. Grace, put down the phone.
I don't even know what it is.
Anyway, I win, so I have a healthy relationship with my phone.
Yeah, it's probably true. But I don't actually engage on Twitter much. I tweet a lot. I get a lot of news out of Twitter. but I don't engage very much. So I don't get into that whole kind of, I sometimes do, and sometimes it's very unhealthy. Sometimes it actually is related to my mental health. I had a really quite a bad spat with Johnny Mercer when he was the defence minister. But it was one of those things where once I got into the fight, I wouldn't stop. But then I had a phone call from a mate who just said, "Listen, mate, put your phone down." And I realised that I was going over the top, and actually I was a bit manic. And that's the truth.
How do you find managing your life on social media?
Well, I think because I actually have a really healthy relationship with social media. Like whenever I get trolled, which is actually quite a lot, just because of like who he is, and also doing comedy and like being a woman and whatever. It just does not bother me because I've been getting told that my dad's a war criminal since I was 14 years old. So I have such thick skin. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Right.
It just doesn't. So I have I'm really good at separating myself from it and at being able to. And I think that's probably because of like what I've gone through already. Whereas other people who are like sort of in my stage of what they're doing are so affected by it. I'm really, really good at saying, I'm not going to look at my phone now. I'm not going to read that or whatever.
You get upset by some of the reviews in Edinburgh.
But that's completely different than getting trolled. Like getting a bad review is like different because that's actually being read by other people.
And I mean, in a way, Alastair, you were the original spin doctor. And we are now in a society where we are all our spin doctors.
I think Julius Caesar was.
Oh, all right then. Okay.
Veni, vidi, vici is one of the greatest soundbites of all time.
But wouldn't you agree that we have gone from a period 25 years ago where we were trying to manipulate the media narrative, the mainstream media narrative, and it was relatively possible to do, to now we're all our own spin doctors trying to weave this, best life narrative, which is incredibly corrosive for our mental health.
Yeah, I agree up to a point, but the funny thing that I find, because of the way that the mainstream media has developed, I find that, so you take the period that we're going through now with Johnson as Prime Minister and this whole kind of culture war thing going on, you'd think with a more atomised social media landscape that it would be much harder for a government with a very clear, I think really unpleasant messaging narrative to be able to get that across. But because they've got the newspapers so in their pocket, they can do it, and they've got all these client journalists who are very, very loud and vocal on social media. So I think, in a funny sort of way, we're even more in the old ways than we were. I thought when social media came along,
the question wasn't actually about politics. Let's stop.
It is exactly. Thanks, Grace.
It's more about its effect on our but he doesn't quite understand that because he doesn't consume social media in that way. My dad only consumes social media in terms of politics and trees. Like that's literally it.
Football.
Whereas and football, fine. Whereas like the way that I'm fed and have been fed social media is a much more exactly what you're saying. It's like, look at how amazing my life is. Look at how great my partner is. And, that's something that I've just been countering. And I've never, ever, again, probably because I've got this really thick skin, I think it's such bullshit. And so I think that's what I've always tried to do on social media is be very much more like, you don't have to be like living this great.
And do you think your generation is turning against that kind of #perfect life?
I think it's becoming quite cringe to still be doing that. Look, there are always going to be like basic people who like want that, but I think it is because it's not the sort of like popular consensus anymore. No, I think it's much cooler to be like, I don't like give a shit. I'll be honest about what I'm going through. Yeah.
I
think this thing about thick skin's interesting though, because I funny enough, Roy Stewart and I talked about that this morning. Where he was saying that my kind of view of politicians is they've just got to kind of, you've got to be able to take it. And he said that's very limiting for the sort of person who might be able to take it. And part of the book that I'm working on at the moment is about saying to young people, listen, if you really believe stuff, get involved and get engaged. And it's not I'm saying you have to have a thin skin and ignore it, but you do have to learn how to deal with it. And I think it probably...
But how would you... Because I say this to people a lot, because like... I said, like, there's so many people like that I'm friends with who are really affected by it. Like, there's this website called Tattle, which is like evil, and they talk about me and my friends a lot on it. And I just don't read it. I have no desire to, and I never will. But it's like a horrible website. People bitch about like influencers, and they talk about Anoni a lot on it. And she religiously reads it, and I can't understand why she does because it's like self-harm. But when I say to her, just stop reading, it's like that's so much easier said than done.
Yeah.
And so how do you help someone
I think
develop a thicker skin.
Well, I think one of the reasons that Grace is able to is because she saw that. I think it's working out when it matters and when it doesn't. And I know that's also easier said than done. But like I always say, if you're in the middle of if you're being attacked a lot over stuff, you've got to decide for yourself. Well, have they got a point? If you decide they haven't got a point, that it's just abuse, then just look the other way. Don't let it into your head. Now, I know that's quite difficult, but it's something that I think you can develop and learn. And Grace has done that. There's no doubt about that because, I can remember, Grace is somebody now who, when we're out and about, and it doesn't happen that much, but it happens a bit that I'll get a bit of aggro in the street or people will have a go or whatever. Grace is absolutely brilliant at just sort of, I remember there's one in that Trump demo when this guy comes up and I thought he was going to hit me, right? And Grace is just straight in his face and I just kind of, I just disappear into the crowd.
Like a bulldog.
But in a way, you're right. If you've been trolled from a very young age or your parents have been trolled or you've experienced
the key
you've
is
got a thick skin that
I'm
makes you...
I'm thinking about this a lot at the moment because especially so where I'm trying to up my game with my stand-up now is like one of the most impressive things that I think that stand-up comedians can do is like talking to the audience, right? And not just like hecklers, but like the way that you can communicate with people like on the cuff. And I used to have a really bad temper. So if something like that happened when I was 15, I would have like lost my rag and then you'd have been shouting at me for shouting at the person. And the best way to deal with people like that is really calmly because it freaks them out. Because then they're more like, oh my God, I feel like an idiot because this person's in the face of me abusing them, just being so chill and like, I don't know why you care. My friend said this thing the other day, this waiter was really rude to me and he was like really shouting at me for no reason. And my friend who was with me just turned to him and said, you seem really distressed. Are you okay? And that really freaked him out because then he felt like, because he was, I just triggered him. I had no idea what happened. I think I reminded him of someone.
If you diffuse it, you're disarming people.
Yeah, exactly.
Getting onto the subject of mental health, Alastair, I wonder if you could just talk a bit about, obviously you've done so much to break down the stigma surrounding mental health and the conversations and the openness around mental health. Could you just briefly touch on how there was perhaps a very different culture in your parents' day and how you sought to break that down within your own family?
Well, it sort of started with my family in a way. My very, very first experience of mental illness was when we're in the island where my dad came from, in the Hebrides, Tiree. And somebody who was on a neighbouring croft was being sectioned. I was only about 7 or 8. I was absolutely mesmerised by it. And there's an ambulance, the police cars. I won't say who it was, but it was a guy called Sydney. What was extraordinary, though, was that it was almost like this. I was watching this thing going on, but nobody quite wanted to say what it was all about.
Yeah.
And it's because, quotes, you didn't talk about it. So it was like lots of, poor Sydney, and whatever. And then I remember my mum, who, as Grace will testify, one of the nicest people ever breathed, and sort of really kind to everybody and what have you. But I remember she had a relative who I now know had really bad depression and anxiety, but it was always called, she's got a bit of nerves. It was always this sort of language. And then what the big turning point for us was when my brother was diagnosed with schizophrenia, because then we had to absolutely sort of, learn about it and just get more stuck in. But even with that, my mum, when I started to get involved in campaigning on mental health, and that was the real reason, was my brother, and my own issues sort of came later. But my mum was always very, very worried about it. It was almost like, and actually your mum was, Fiona was as well. When I first started talking about it, she wasn't enthusiastic. It was like, why are you putting yourself out there? I felt a really powerful need to do it. I did, yeah. I felt when I started writing the novels and writing the book and doing the documentaries, I felt it inside. I was sort of being pushed to do it. And I do think a lot of it was about Donald as well. It's like, in fact, before he died, we were talking about doing something together about his schizophrenia and the impact that it had on his life. And and that's another thing that's great with the kids is that, Grace has talked about anxiety and I just think the open, Callum, who's struggled, is touched wood 9 years off alcohol, but, we've had struggles, and I just think the openness is such a big part of the solution. So,
and Grace, growing up in that sort of culture of openness, did you find it therefore really
Well, it wasn't
helpful
that,
or
no.
actually
Well, I don't think
difficult.
it actually was that. I mean, I think like it was definitely. So I'm just
What?
thinking about
What?
the expose that I'm going to write about you one day.
Okay.
Oh,
So
pray
we've
tell.
got this ongoing joke, yeah, that he's like the face of talking about mental health when I come in and I'm like convinced to have cancer because I have like really bad OCD and like terrible health anxiety. He's just like, shut the fuck up.
No, I'm
And
not
that's
sure.
going to be my expose one day is Alastair Campbell's not actually
No, excuse me.
great as he thinks
Can I
he
just
is.
put this in context, right? One night, Fiona and I are lying in bed, fast asleep, and Grace comes in to tell us, as she's on the phone to 999, she's having a heart attack. And I said, Grace, you're not having a heart attack. Let us get back to sleep, right?
And then we'd seen Daniel Blake, and at the end, you know, not to spoil it, but there's a heart attack. And then I had what is called a phantom heart attack, which is like a empathy, like I woke up in the middle of the night, but it was a panic attack, basically. Anyway, that's another story. Was there a cultural... there was. I remember when he first told me that he had depression. And then I remember when I then had my first panic attack, and it did feel like I had a bit more of an understanding of what this was. Well, I remember actually I was in Paris and I called my mum, and I hadn't slept for 2 days because I had this panic attack, but I thought I'd been drugged. So I thought I was like hallucinating. And I thought I didn't know what a panic attack was. And I called my mum and I described to her what had happened. And she said, oh, it sounds like you've got anxiety. And I was like, what is that? I didn't know what it was. She was like, oh, your dad's got that. And my dad did Andrew Marr when we were younger, and he had a panic attack like during the show. Yeah. And I remember watching that. This was way before I had my first panic attack. I remember watching that and thinking, what the fuck is he doing? Just speak. And then as I started to experience it, I really understood what it felt like. I think actually anxiety, all mental health conditions are so hard to empathize with unless you've felt them, basically, which is why it can be sometimes infuriating. And it's not their fault talking to people who don't know what you're talking about, because it feels like they're like, oh, okay. It's like it feels like they're sort of talking to you like you're talking about like an imaginary friend, and they're like not quite understanding it or grasping it, and then you feel a bit more mad.
Do you think that's true even now? I mean, there's such a kind of
I think people try so hard,
honesty.
but it is so hard to understand exactly what it feels like. And actually everyone's mental health condition also feels different. It's like my experiences of like anxiety will feel really different to his, but it is really difficult. And it's difficult because say if I'm sitting here right now, I mean, I'm not right now, but say if I was sitting here right now and then tomorrow I said to you that whole time I was having an out-of-body experience, you wouldn't have known because I'm really good at pretending I'm fine. I once did a whole stand-up show. Sadiq Khan was in the audience with like 6 security guards. The whole show, I wasn't in my body. I was like up there watching myself perform. No one in the audience would have known. So it is hard because, like, do you know what I mean? It's hard to articulate when it's happening. You don't want to, like, speak on it to make it worse. Yeah.
I mean, my father we're gradually realising, he died 3 years ago, and we're gradually realising that he had quite severe depression at various episodes throughout his life, and he was a hoarder as well. And that was the kind of almost physical demonstration of his depression. But we're only now reassessing. When he was alive, we never talked about it. We never addressed it. We almost made a joke of his hoarding. And it just, in that example, I think for me personally, I'm really feeling a real generational shift. And what interests me is what's the political end result here? Because, say in the 30s and 40s, you had that momentum towards the formation of the National Health Service. Are we heading now towards the formation of a National Mental Health Service?
Well, I wish we were.
Not with this government, no.
Not with this government, but the conversation is changing, right? And so what's the goal?
Look, for me, the goal's already there in the National Health Service Constitution, which is parity between physical and mental health. And I think a lot of this is about, mental health in the family, mental health in the workplace, I think is incredibly important. Employers are important.
But also access to therapy. Yes. I mean, the problem is at the moment, like, it's so hard to get therapy. And so actually, if we're talking about your mental health is amazing, right? Talking about it with your friends and family. Talking to a professional is incredibly important, especially if you're in like a crisis. And because
services aren't there.
It's absolutely.
I think it's about the big thing is about services, but I think the attitudes will help shape that. But at the moment, I honestly feel we're going forward on attitudes and backwards on services, and that's a real problem.
But there is a potential for mental health provision being a vote winner in a sense. Yeah.
And also, it's not just about votes, it's about actually there's a potential for it to end up saving the government loads and loads and loads of money. I do mental health stuff in prisons, and if you go into prison, right, you basically meet people who, in the main, who should be in hospital, okay? And a lot of them may have done bad things and they're a danger to society, but in part they're a danger to society because of the lives that they've led and the mental health problems that they're dealing with. Now, if you could fix those people in terms of what goes on inside their head, I'll tell you another story. Callum, our second son, who, when he got into trouble with alcohol, and we tried everything. And actually, it's interesting about when you said the thing about the generational thing, I made a lot of the same mistakes with him that the older generations made with me. So even if you have had the experience, it doesn't always help you deal with it well. But when he finally kind of hit his rock bottom, as it were, we got him into this rehab place in Scotland. Very expensive. You know, it was the only way we could do it. And the place was kept going, this place up in Scotland, by the Dutch government, because the Dutch government were funding their toughest cases of addicts to go there and spend up to 6 months there to get sorted. Because the Dutch government had worked out, if we don't do that, these people are just going to be in and out of prison, in and out of the divorce courts, in and out of violence, in and out of all the stuff that they were doing. So they're trying to fix them. Yeah. And that's the attitude to take.
Yeah, we have such a broken view of the relationship between mental health and addiction, and it just absolutely makes no sense.
Okay, so we're going to do the quick fire round now, okay? So I just want you to each briefly tell me, what was your first political memory? Alastair.
First active political memory?
Don't say 1997.
No, that definitely wasn't that. I've got a vague memory of I'll tell you one of the funniest, well, it's not funny because somebody died, but I'll tell you a story about when my mum came I was out in the garden with my dad and my uncle James, and my mum came out and said, Ian McLeod's dead. And Ian McLeod was a member of the cabinet. And my uncle James said, what, the pipe major? Because he was a big bagpipe guy, and I was sort of confused by this Ian McLeod. So I remember Ian McLeod's death.
Were they the same person?
No, not at all. Not at all. A totally different person. Yeah. And I think then I can't. You see, I struggle to know what is a real memory and what is a learnt memory. So I think I can remember one of Harold Wilson's elections vividly, but I don't know if that's because I've seen so many pictures of it since.
Okay, right. And Grace, what about you?
I mean, I was just probably my first memory would have been political.
Yeah.
No.
Well,
your first words were Gary Neville.
That's true. I mean, I sort of remember being on the steps of Downing Street the day that Tony Blair became Prime Minister, but that's also because I've seen so many pictures of me then. So I'm not sure if that is a memory or
live on TV,
from
Grace,
picture. It's the only video footage I have of me as a child because they was so busy they didn't film someone who's going to one day be a really famous comedian. So there's literally no footage of me.
I do feel really bad about that.
Really bad. Like the documentary of my life is just going to start when I'm like 15.
Philip Gould's got stuff.
Barely of me.
Right.
No, I don't. No,
but that's because we don't. Fiona and I don't quite share this sort of sense of, that everything we do in our life has to be filmed.
Sorry, are you joking? You sit on Instagram. You film so much more of your life than me.
I talk.
You sit on Instagram.
Okay, right. Hang on a minute. Next question. Right, what was your first music purchase and in what format? Because that will date you.
It was 2 singles, Frank and Nancy Sinatra, Then I Go and Spoil It All by Saying Something Stupid Like I Love You, and Mamas and the Papas Each Night Before You Go to Bed. And it was 2 vinyl singles. Got no idea how old I was. It was before I left Yorkshire, so it was before I was probably about 9.
Wow.
My first CD that I bought or that my mum bought for me was Nelly and Kelly Rowland, Dilemma.
Classic. Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Okay. And what was your first job and what did you get paid?
My first job, I started babysitting when I was 14 years old.
What did you get paid?
Grace hasn't really had a job.
Sorry, what are you talking about? I actually had so many jobs.
I'm getting a real insight into your dynamics.
I was such a grafter.
Guys.
I had at one point I had 4 waitressing jobs all over London because I was saving money to go to the Caribbean. But I used to babysit for like £5 an hour.
£5 an hour.
And I used to make my mum pay me to walk my own dog.
Oh, that's savvy.
Yeah.
Okay, Alastair.
Working on my uncle's farm.
What did you get paid?
He was so generous, honestly. My Uncle Jim. He used to, every Sunday, I used to work there every summer, and every Sunday he'd just leave on my bed an envelope with a couple £100 notes in it.
Really?
So generous.
What, in the like 1930s?
He was actually
How
no. It's about
so rich?
I did listen. I was a grafter as well. To be fair, all my kids are grafters. They all work. But I used to go up there, work for several months. The school holidays, and he'd just pay me loads of cash, and loved him forever.
Tough work.
R.I.P.
So I want to talk about identity politics. And Tony Blair went on Good Morning Britain when you were hosting and said, I feel so old now. I've got to the stage in life where I feel like I could say something inappropriate and I really have to guard what I say.
Did he say that?
Yeah.
Stop it.
Do you feel like that, or do you?
No, I think. Do I feel like? No, I don't really. There are some issues where I don't. And I do say to Grace, like for example, I do getting my head around all the trans issues. I find quite difficult.
Yeah, but he's so open. Like we talk about it a lot. So I never worry that my dad's going to go on TV and say something. And that really shows that, like, I think if Tony Blair was my dad, I'd worry. So
if you were advising Keir Starmer now how to answer the question, what is a woman, what would be your advice?
God, what would my advice be?
Well, we had that chat, didn't we, before you did that event with Matt Ford, and we spoke this through. Yeah, I can't answer the question for you.
Go on, answer it for me because I've forgotten. What did I say?
Someone who identifies, self-identifies as a woman is a woman.
But what I do politically, when you talk about advice, I'd say, have the words to deal with that as an issue, but do not have that centre stage in your political programme. Not because it doesn't matter; it matters incredibly to to people who are affected. But do not, because what's happening with this culture politics is that the right, with all this stuff about, I actually get really angry when people say, oh, you don't know what you can say anymore. I'm not talking about Tony Blair, because I think he was talking about one or two specific things where he thought he didn't quite know how to handle it. But these people who say, oh, you can't say what they basically mean, a lot of them, is you can't be racist, you can't be sexist, and it's not as much fun as it used to be.
But you famously said and advised Tony Blair once, to say we don't do God. And it was like, veer off the religion because it's a bit controversial.
That's one of those myths, actually. It's true that I thought...
He loves God.
No, I don't.
We love reading the Bible of late, don't we?
Really?
In German.
We read the
Bible.
Bible.
My goodness. Okay.
The Bible's a great book.
But getting back onto cancel culture, because I think there is a case for saying that the left has abandoned the issues of class for the issues of identity politics.
I don't believe that, though. I think
Why not?
There may be, because I think there may be some who have, but I think it's a trap that's being laid by the right.
But also a lot of these things do intersect with each other. And a lot of the most marginalised trans people will also be working class because they don't have access to some of the resources. That's where I think we sort of forget the nuance in a lot of these conversations.
I hope. So if you think the way that sometimes at the moment people talk about trans people, it sort of reminds me of, back a few decades. I can remember...
Yeah, say this point. It's a really good point. When he said this, I was like, wow. Say the point you're going to say.
What was I going to say?
Say it.
Well, if it might not be the same
Basically,
point.
what he said at this Matt Ford show, and I was sitting in the audience because Matt Ford started talking about trans people, and I know I don't agree with a lot of Matt's opinions on this. So I was like, okay, come on, Dad, you got this. And he said this thing, which I didn't even tell him to say because I never really thought about this, but it is true. the way transphobic people now, we will view them in 20 years the same way that we now view homophobic people in the 80s and 90s.
And racists.
They will be so outdated, and it will be embarrassing for them that was their opinion. So even though they have the internet and they feel like everyone's on their side, in 10 to 15 years, it will be truly tragic. And like, I'd be embarrassed if my parents or anyone that I'm associated with had those views 15 years
It's a
ago.
bit like looking back at Section 28 in the
Yeah,
80s and just
exactly,
going...
exactly,
No, but listen,
exactly.
that's
But
how
so
change
many
comes.
people at that time thought that was an appropriate thing to be behind. So I think, I mean, that was a really good point that he made, because actually a lot of these people are so, they feel so defined by this conversation at the moment. Almost because I'm like, is it because you don't have enough to talk about? Like, what is it that you're lacking in your life that you feel that you have to constantly be badgering on about the same thing? But like he said, they will soon be very, very embarrassing.
And that means the other thing that really worries me about the way this debate is developing is, if we're talking on the day that the government's presenting a Queen's speech, there's nothing in it. They've got no big plan for the country. It's the same as last year. We're going to have a bonfire of Brexit red tape. We're going to level up. It's just slogans, right? So this culture war stuff replaces it. And that's what I mean about it being a trap for it's a right wing. A lot of it, I think, is a right wing trap for the left. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't real issues, right? But I think often, you like Grace is a comedian, right? So when I was growing up, there was that program, The Comedians. It was on national television, right? And I can't remember the guy, was it Williams? His name was Williams. And he was a black comedian who was surrounded by racism on the screen. And we had to laugh at it because that was the only comedy that you were given. And you look at that now and you think, did people really do that stuff? That's progress. And the people who now say, oh, you can't say what you want to say and all that, they basically don't like the idea of change and progress.
So going from division to unity...
They also are people who just don't know how to make a good joke.
There's also
So they have to rely on like really bad, cheap jokes because they're intellectual humour.
I was telling Grace last night, there was a Scottish football writers' dinner up in Glasgow last night. A load of the women walked out. There's some comedian who was, old style.
Yeah, I've heard that,
There you go.
Yeah. And what do you think, I mean, we're going from division to unity here, but do you feel that society is more siloed? I mean, for example, Grace, do you have many friends that are conservatives? Do you have any friends that are conservatives?
I've got a couple of friends whose parents are conservatives, but no friends that would vote conservative, no.
Alistair, you're smirking.
Smirking. I'd say most of my...
Rory Stewart, BFF.
Yeah.
I'd say most of my friends would have politics closer to mine. But I don't think that defines... I don't think I define everything by politics. Got a few red lines in our house.
What are they?
Private education is quite a red line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say even people who vote... I've fallen out with a lot of people on that. Even people who would vote Labour. But when I have conversations with people who I'm friends with, and I say, if you send your kids to private schools, we will really fall out about it at the time.
And what about Brexiteers?
Yeah, we got. I've got
friends.
I've got friends who voted Brexit, and I'll never let them forget it.
No, I've got friends who didn't vote, which I also think is just as offensive. But no, I don't think I've got.
But I don't see that as being siloed, because they're only siloed if you say that they're utterly defined by their politics. So I've got a friend I can think of who I know voted Brexit, but my friendship with them is defined by football. I've got another person, and not a close friend, but somebody I know voted Brexit, but my relationship with them is defined by the fact that I see them in the queue at the Lido every morning. Yeah. So we don't talk about Brexit, or if we do, it's I give him another Financial Times cutting,
which is a gentle reminder that Twitter is not the real world. I mean, back in the 1990s, Philip Gould defined Dagenham man and how important that kind of idea that person was for New Labour, and giving that person someone to vote for in the aftermath of Thatcher. What do you think the modern equivalent of Dagenham man is?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, those labels are just so sort of difficult and
Yeah.
a bit tedious. I mean, I think it's. I know what Philip meant by that. It was basically saying that it was the aspirational working class. Now there are and that should always be who people are thinking about helping. helping them to achieve their
But
aspirations.
also that was too narrow. So like the point is that was so specific, whereas actually like the definition of that is that there isn't one, because there's so many different versions of it.
And in a way,
and always have been, by the way. It's not like trans people have just started to exist and minorities have just started to exist. They've always existed. They've just like only now had enough sort of like platform, I guess, to be able to
political labels are shifting, aren't they? I mean, people, you know, if they're Labour voters that have voted Brexit and now potentially moving to the Tories, where historically in their family, they, you know, it would be unfathomable to have voted Tory.
Lots of things have changed, but one of them is that I don't think politics is as central in people's lives as it was, because people have become a bit more disengaged. I think that's a bad thing. I think it's a dangerous thing. But also, I just think parents are perhaps less prescriptive than maybe they were. And people move around a lot more. People are more mobile. So they're open to more influences and so forth. But I do find it quite extraordinary that Johnson, who his background is, we all know his background, Eton and Oxbridge and media and total toff, basically. And yet somehow has managed to make this link with, quotes, the common man, for whom Johnson in his heart has complete contempt.
But isn't that one of the signals of populism? I mean, whether you look at Trump or, Boris, it's people of the establishment that are able to articulate the views of...
I mean, well, just think about the thing with him and Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer came from a working class family, had a pretty tough childhood, lots of different ways, and yet Johnson feels capable of dismissing as the metropolitan elite Islington man. Keir Starmer's never lived in Islington. Boris Johnson has. All it shows is that Boris Johnson is very good at campaigning as long as he's allowed to lie a lot.
I mean, you could argue that Thatcher did that, Blair did that to a certain extent.
No, this guy's in a different... The modern politician, Trump, him, Putin, Erdogan, they're in a different league. I would never... You'd be very hard-pressed to go and find anything I ever wrote suggesting that Margaret Thatcher was a liar. You find lots of things me disagreeing with her.
She did emphasise certain... she'd never really talked about the fact that she married a millionaire and that was the one way that she was able to get into politics. Talked a lot about her father and living above the shop and all of that.
I don't think that's a significant point. The point is that she had a vision. She knew what she wanted to do with power. And she knew why she wanted it, to make change. I didn't agree with a lot of the change, but I could respect her. I can have no respect for somebody who doesn't really believe in much other than being there and surrounds himself with these numpties who never ever speak truth to power.
So speaking of change then, Grace, what do you think are the political priorities for your generation? What does it feel like is pressing right now?
I mean, again, I think it so varies depending on who you are and what your circumstances are. The cost of living is just on a day-to-day having such a deep impact on like all young people. And it's really hard, especially in London, to get started. I mean, I don't know anyone. I'm 28 now. I don't know anyone who's bought a house like my age, apart from really rich people who are like from a lot of money. I don't have a thing. Whereas you and Mum bought your first flat when you were like 23.
24, 25.
Yeah.
And in fact, actually, that's a good counterpoint because in a way, the life that you led, as I said, grammar school boy done good.
I was only at grammar school for a term, by the way.
Really? I thought you went to 3 different grammar schools.
No, I went to grammar school.
No, he was in a shoebox.
Then and then I went to the City of Leicester Boys, which became a comprehensive. And it's one of my...
Oh, but if it was an ex-grammar school, basically had the attributes of a grammar school without
boy
being
has
a grammar
field.
school.
It was a comprehensive school, and it was the same comprehensive school attended by
Gary
Lineker and Emil Heskey.
Well, there you go.
3 great footballers, weren't there?
But you were the benefactor of a certain set of conditions, house prices, social mobility, a welfare state.
We did borrow off.
But also,
none of that is available to your generation the same way.
The world and the industry that you were in then had a much easier, obvious sort of trajectory, like upward trajectory. There are obviously like so many professions now where that is the case, but say like one of my best friends is a secondary school teacher and she's struggling to buy a house and she's been a secondary school teacher for like 4 years, which like wouldn't have been the case then. So I think that is obviously a huge issue and it's not getting any better right now. I mean, the environment it goes without saying, is something that like dominates a lot of people's minds. But I would say, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently, because I remember when even I started using social media, I spoke about politics so much more than I would now. I don't think I ever really do now. I'm not because I've switched off, but because we all absolutely just can't deal with it. It's so incredibly infuriating,
right?
And almost feels like a drain. And I say this to him a lot. It feels like it drains energy off of me, which I don't then get back. So I'm like, I can't spend so much of my life stressing out about it, because then I will just eat myself up.
Yeah.
Whereas I'd rather like spend my energy on things that will actually
That's what they want,
help
though.
my life.
But so, Alastair, you're writing a book about young people and politics. How would you answer some of the points that Grace has made on that?
I totally understand it. And sometimes I feel like that myself. But I think you have to find a way of resisting it, because I think if young people don't stay engaged and don't stay a bit angry and use that anger to fight for change, then this lot keep winning.
But then when you're talking about young people, I think you've got to segment them in two different camps, really. The kind of young activist, a lot of time on their hands, quite often quite idealistic, that naivety, beautiful naivety that comes with youth on the one hand. And they're the ones right now on the protests and rallying for climate change and all that. And then you've got the young people.
I don't think there are enough of them doing that.
Well,
you talk about the
perhaps
protests.
not, but
Where are the protests?
Well,
at
there's
the
more
moment?
protests now than there were in the 1960s, believe it or not, in terms of numbers and
Really?
Okay. On streets and the amount of protests.
Okay.
What I think is interesting is you've got this millennial generation who are now actually quite old. You know, I mean, I'm the geriatric millennial end. I'm born in 1981. And like you say, the housing crisis, we've lived through a financial crash. We entered the workplace when wages stalled and house prices went up. We then went through Brexit, then COVID, and now cost of living crisis. You know, our opportunity to get on any kind of ladder is just like the stumbling blocks have been...
I get that, but I think what I would also say is that change often comes through... It's interesting, if you go through history, change often comes through pandemic, change often comes through war, but most change does require political change. And I think at the moment, it suits the interests of what I call the bad guys, that a lot of the good people are just thinking, oh, this is so bad, I can't engage. I've got to duck out of this. And I get why they do it. Funnily enough, back to the Lido queue with this very nice guy who's a doctor who was there this morning. He said, just to look after myself, I've got to switch off. I can't watch the news. I can't. Otherwise, I haven't got enough space in my head to do what I need to do.
Yeah, and I think Grace is right. I think there's an exhaustion, particularly, I think, precipitated by Brexit and COVID, where everyone's like, the government infiltrates every aspect of my life on a minute-by-minute basis.
Also, you have to understand,
it feels paralysing.
You've been in it, you feel you can have more of an impact. But if people just have to ultimately look after themselves, which really is all you can do.
Yeah, part of the book
before you can try and change the world and do all the things you're talking about. You can't do that if you don't feel
part of the point
mentally
of the book
strong.
Is actually I'll be identifying lots of young people who are doing stuff, who are making change. You know, there's some of them, like, you know, I do find Greta Thunberg just an incredible phenomenon, because you can't measure the change, but she has, it's incredible what she's done in terms of using her personality profile, passion, etc. to, you know, to be such a voice of change. And then somebody like Jack Monroe on food poverty, and there's loads of people who are just doing stuff, and that will bring change. It is change, and it will bring more change. But ultimately, and what I'm saying to lots of people who, because I haven't got a title of the book yet, but the working title is, but what can I do? Because that's what people ask all the time, but what can I do? And my answer is always, you do whatever you can. And, you know, and actually in a funny sort of way, I had a hilarious message. You know Ross Noble, the comedian?
Yeah.
Right, so he sent me a message yesterday about the podcast. He said, will you please, I'm loving the podcast, but will you please tell Rory Stewart to stop describing Boris Johnson as a comedian? He's not funny. His comic timing is shit. His material is useless. And any comedian would destroy him in 5 minutes at Prime Minister's Questions. And so comedy can actually... So there's lots of different ways of bringing change.
Keir Starmer
My point is,
funnier.
ultimately, politics is what brings about a lot of change. And people
Yes, but you can also bring about change in smaller ways that has to be applauded. Like one of my best friends from school's just last week been elected to be a councillor in like South Hampstead, which is where we're from. And she's someone who's definitely wants to do that on a bigger scale, is very ambitious, but also can see how much impact she can have locally.
Yeah.
And it really, I mean, even like what we're talking about with mental health, it's like, I know that the effect I've had on people in my life, because I've been in therapy, and I can help therapize them because they can't get therapy or can't afford therapy or can't get free therapy because the NHS is fucked. That's a small way of helping people. So I also can see that. And he thinks on a much bigger scale, which I understand because that's professionally what you've been doing for such a long time. But you can do that on a very small scale and still feel like you've done something, basically.
Right. On that positive note, I want to thank you both for your honesty and your reflections and your insights, and also this fantastic illuminating insight into your relationship.